Back to the domestic side of things. This week, the Congressional Budget Office reported that raising the minimum wage could cost as many as 500,000 jobs by 2016. But supporters of raising the minimum wage say, not so fast. Dr. Veghte, why is that?
Well, first of all, let me say that I have tremendous respect for the Congressional Budget Office. They do great work. In this case, this is a case, you often have it in the economics profession of using abstract models to predict the future. And you need to do that in some cases where you don't have empirical data to work with. But in this case, we have lots of empirical data. There have been many cases in the U.S. and abroad where the minimum wage was increased. And all you have to do, it's an empirical question, it's not a theoretical question. So there was a case back in the late 1990s where it was raised in New Jersey, and it was studied by economists and found to have no negative or possibly a modest impact on jobs, but overall benefited the economy much more than it cost jobs. The consensus in the economics profession is that raising the minimum wage in a moderate way, like is currently being proposed to $10.10 an hour, has modest or negligible effects on the job market. What it does do, though, is put more money in the pockets of working Americans. As you know, in England, they raised the minimum wage in the late 1990s, and that's been studied extensively, and that was found to reduce wage inequality in the bottom half of the income scale. So overall, the empirical evidence is clear that we don't have to worry about losing a great number of jobs through raising the minimum wage, but we will gain from doing so, and that workers will have more money in their pockets, creates more demand for goods, it'll stimulate the economy, and it's a net win.
Well, here we go. This is where we're going to fiercely disagree. Finally, for once, is that I would say to the contrary, that there's been a track record of studies that have shown that the minimum wage, it does indeed kill jobs. And now, granted, it's still a very hotly debated subject in the economics field. I grant you that. But there have been numerous macro analyses or literature reviews that look over basically decades of minimum wage studies, and the broad majority of them show that most economic studies conclude that that raising the minimum wage results in more unemployment. I mean, it's economics 101. You raise the price of a good, it results in less demand. The good being labor in this case, and the demand being jobs available. So. And I think you can see this. You can see this not just empirically, or not just theoretically through economics, but also empirically, and the data. If you look at the teenage unemployment rate, and especially the unemployment rate for minorities, there have been clear correlations with spikes in the minimum wage. As Milton Friedman said, once famously said that the minimum wage is the most anti-black law in the country, and I would have to say that because when you set a wage floor, you are pricing out low skilled individuals whose labor is valued as not being worth that. So I would have to say that, unfortunately, raising the minimum wage would just be disastrous for the American economy. And we see this also in a very real sense in Europe today, where you have countries like France with a very high minimum wage, where they have a youth unemployment rate of about 25%. And I think perhaps it wouldn't be as drastic if the minimum wage were raised to $10.10, but it would certainly result in a very real, concrete Americans, especially young minority Americans, being left without a job.
Well, Casey is right about what he says about economics 101 textbooks, saying that if you raise the minimum wage, it will cost jobs. But as I said before, that's economic theory. It's not actual empirical reality. We have plenty of empirical experiments of raising the minimum wage. And the example is in France. It's Britain, where they actually raised it from a low point to a higher point, and that was studied extensively and was found not to cost jobs. So that's number one. Beyond that, it would stimulate the economy and would put more money in people's pockets. If you over the last 30 years, most of the income gains, almost all of the income gains, have gone to the top 1% of the population, and actually to the top 1/10 of 1%. Well, wages have stagnated at the bottom of the income spectrum. The minimum wage since 1968 has declined from about $9.60 in 1968 in today's dollars to $7.25 today. So it's gone down from $9.60 to $7.25 over 30 years. It should have gone up and kept pace with inflation. So we simply can't have an economy that succeeds where large, tens of millions of workers are earning, sub-poverty wages. Our economy, we're the strongest economy in the world. We can afford to pay our workers a minimum wage that allows them to at least live at the poverty level.
I guess my response would be that I think that if you look across the world, there's certainly examples where you have a high minimum wage results in high unemployment. Speaking of Europe, some of the most successful economies there, such as Germany, such as some of the Scandinavian countries, have no minimum wage whatsoever. Granted, it is through labor unions that largely negotiate wages, but this kind of myth that the minimum wage is an absolute fundamental function of government of setting this is just is a myth and can be seen through countries throughout the world. And I think another thing that should be emphasized that's often not stressed with the minimum wage is that it is a universal one-size-fits-all solution for states that are very, very different. So perhaps 10 per hour is very much necessary in states and cities with high cost of living, like Washington, D.C., like New York. But we have to remember that this is also going to apply to Midwestern cities with lower costs of living, like Utah or any Midwestern states. And that could really very drastically result in unemployment there. So I would say that it's just a very dangerous policy. And unfortunately, this is a case where I think that unfortunately you see people a lot of people who are against raising the minimum wage are often viewed as heartless, but in reality, it's the results of the minimum wage of raising them that hurts the most vulnerable aspects of society. So.
Well, I would respond to that. We've seen a real empirical case of lowering the minimum wage. We've done that over the last 40 years. We've been lowering it steadily, and that has not led to a boon in jobs for low-income workers. We still have very high unemployment for low-income workers. So we've tried that and it hasn't worked. In England, it's been tried. Raising the minimum wage has been tried. It has worked. It worked in New Jersey. I think it can work here. And another point is that if you don't raise the minimum wage, you have to do something else about poverty. And what else can you do, or do you do? You have anti-poverty programs where the government spends taxpayers' money on the EITC, on SSI for retirees who don't have enough to retire on, and other housing programs, Medicaid. And studies have been done showing that if you raise the minimum wage, you would save a considerable amount of money in public spending on these other social programs. So it would actually save money for the government and for taxpayers if you raise the minimum wage.
And what about the employer? What about the employee?
Well, if you raise the minimum wage for the entire country at the same time, if I have a restaurant or a fast food restaurant or a regular restaurant, all of my competitors are having the same increase in labor costs at the same time. So it doesn't really hurt me competitively. I may cut my profits slightly, but I think that's legitimate and given the income inequality that we have.
But there are many businesses that are struggling and.
Right, but they're not going to lose customers if all of their competition has the same effect at the same time. So I think it's there's no perfect solution. You could also, if you preferred, you could raise income taxes and redistribute wealth. That's another way to address social inequality, but we have to do something. And I think this is something that most people can agree on. 70% of Americans support it.
Casey?
I think that there's kind of, you mentioned one argument that I think is pretty nuanced and has recently just been injected in the minimum wage, which is a lot of people, especially on the left, are arguing that actually minimum wage saves money because of the results of people who would otherwise have to rely on welfare, etc. But I think that really you have to look at trade-offs. So certainly while that is true, that the minimum wage would raising the minimum wage would put a lot of people out of work, would possibly close potential businesses that are really being under stress, and could result in even more people on welfare. So I think that really the empirical evidence is pretty clear. If you look at economic studies, there's a clear consensus, and just theoretically, if there's really no negative effects of doing a moderate wage, why not do even more? Why set the minimum wage at $10.10? These numbers are coming out of nowhere. Why not $15 or $20 or $100? And you really see even Keynesian economists admit that is not a realistic solution because raising such a price would result in joblessness. So I think economists agree, at least in theory, that a minimum wage of too high would result in unemployment. So why isn't that also true on the margin? And I think this really would just have devastating effects on America's most vulnerable.